much for inviting me. I'm also now the new secretary of the Environmental Psychology Division of the APA, so I'm happy to be representing environmental psychology here. I'm sure a lot of you already have studied a lot of the sort of theories that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to try to cover it in an environmental context. So I am the Behavior and Human Dimensions Program Manager at ACAAA, which means that I do research on energy efficiency and why people behave in ways that are energy efficient, how to encourage energy efficiency, and that kind of thing. So today I'll talk to you about some of my experience with changing behaviors in terms of recycling and just general behavior change theory. Okay, so you got to start with targeted interventions. In order for an intervention to be successful, it really needs to be customized. So think about targeting a specific behavior. The more specific you are, the more likely you are to change it. If you're thinking about encouraging pro-environmental behavior on a general scale, you'll be less likely at getting people to recycle than if you're specifically targeting recycling. And even within recycling, if you have an idea of exactly what kind of recycling, you might be more effective at targeting that. So for example, at UVic, where I used to work, we found that by weight, the single most disposed item, actually maybe you guys can guess, any ideas? Just like if you weigh all these things. It's a version of paper. A coffee cup. I was really surprised to find that coffee cups were by weight, the single most disposed item, and those could be composted. So once we knew that, we were able to develop an intervention that specifically targeted the compostable cups. So that's kind of how specificity can help. Before you design an intervention, you got to think of the pre-existing attitudes and values that the people who you're targeting have. You want to work within those motivations rather than try to teach something new. Social and physical context matters, the physical layout of the building, the social and cultural context in terms of people. So if, for example, a lot of the people are commuting, you might not be so successful with a sort of social network approach where people need to talk to each other. And one way to kind of summarize all of these is to think about the stages of change model. Has anybody here heard of these, or the trans-theoretical model? Right on. Okay, so thankfully only 2 people here have heard of it, so I'm going to talk about it. Basically, oh, and before I get to that, I also want to mention that when you design an intervention, you want to think about persistence of the behavior change. Getting people to change their behavior for a short period is one thing, but if you want the behavior to persist after your intervention has completed, you really got to think about that from the outset. Okay, so the stages of change model. The idea is that people progress through 5 stages when they're thinking about changing their behavior. And depending on the stage, you would approach them in a different way. So first step is pre-contemplation. At this stage, most people aren't even thinking about doing the behavior. They're maybe have even negative thoughts, more negative than positive thoughts about the behavior. They're not about to do it. Then moving along, they get to the contemplation phase. At this point, they think it's a good idea. They might potentially do it at some point, but they don't have any serious plans. In the preparation phase, people are starting to make a plan and talking about a specific time at which they'll do it, so within the next 30 days, for example. Then you move into the action phase, where you take your plan and you're actually doing it. At this point, people have just started implementing the behavior and they're trying to keep it up. And then as it plateaus over several months, you move into the maintenance phase, where you just have to continue doing the behaviors and avoid backsliding. Some people suggest there might be another stage at which point you don't even have to try anymore, you just changed, but this is the basic original model. Now you can imagine, you don't want to target an intervention that has to do with planning and preparation if people aren't even thinking about doing the behavior, if they're at the pre-contemplation phase, at the contemplation phase. So depending on your audience, you really want to target your intervention differently. All right, so let's talk about persistence of behavior change. I use this desktop to support my catnip habit, which is a little foreshadowing because we're going to talk about habits now. First of all, there's two aspects to this. Habits is one of them. Intrinsic motivation is another one. If people are just motivated for some sort of external reward, probably most of you are familiar with this research, as soon as the extrinsic reward is removed, the behavior is likely to cease. You know, just like Pavlov's conditioned responses. So if you if your intervention also instills a sense of pride or joy or some sort of intrinsic motivation for doing the behavior, it's more likely to persist after the intervention's implemented, or removed, I should say. And then you also want to think about changing habits. Now, how are habits formed and changed? You need a few conditions. One of them is repetition. So your intervention should allow the opportunity for people to repeat the behavior over and over. You want to set up the context, the contextual cues, the triggers that trigger the behavior should be in place so that the environment is facilitating the behavior. And especially at the beginning, you want to reward the behavior, whether it's positive reward or removing some sort of negative stimuli. And one other aspect to think about here is the habit discontinuity theory. Has anybody heard of this one? Okay, awesome. I'll teach you a new thing. So habit discontinuity theory is the idea that at certain points in your life, when you have major life events, that's when the chance to change your habits is presented. So people are automatic, a lot of behavior is automatic, and it's because of habits, but at certain points key points in your life, like you get married, you move, et cetera, you're able to get in there and try to change your habits at those points. So in a work context, for example, this might be somebody gets a new office, when somebody gets promoted, somebody comes in from working remotely or whatnot. These are key points at which a habit can be changed. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some potential interventions that you could implement. I've broken these down into 3 basic categories. They're kind of arbitrary. Environmental design, psychology-based interventions, which is kind of a grab bag. I couldn't come up with a better term. All of these are really psychology-based, but that's kind of a other category. And then social interventions. So let's get started. Environmental design. Excuse me. So the first thing you could do is change the structure and the environment around which recycling happens. Change the environment to make the behavior more convenient. There's research about when the recycling bin is close to the garbage bin, then you're more likely to see people recycling. You know, you just want to make the behavior as simple as possible. Put the bins exactly where people need them. These two are related. Try to make the environmental option easier and better, and the non-environmental option more difficult or impossible or unpleasant or in some way worse than the environmental option. So you can do this by changing the shape of the garbage bin versus the recycling bin, by changing the location. Let's say, and I think at UVic they were planning on doing this intervention. Paper towels in the washroom, they're all compostable, but we throw them in the garbage. If the compost bin was very easily accessible and a large thing, people would probably throw their paper towels in there. The garbage could be smaller and a little further away, making it less likely people will use it. Simple structural things to nudge behavior. And then changing the default option. Changing the default is a very powerful strategy. And if you can think of creative ways to use it in this case, that might be helpful. I tried to brainstorm one, and the best I could come up with is, if you have a water cooler and the default is to use a disposable cup, instead you remove the disposable cups and make them more difficult. Now the default is to use a reusable mug. By changing that default, you're making a big change in behavior. You might be aware that when people have to opt in for organ donation, they're very unlikely to do it. Whereas if they're signed up automatically and they have to opt out, you get much higher acceptance rates. We haven't impinged on anybody's freedom. They can still choose to do whatever they want, but we've changed the behavior. All right, prompts. So prompts are triggers for behavior. Usually they're posters. That's what I used to use. But sometimes I guess it could be a person or a video or an audio recording. That's kind of elaborate, but actually I did find an example. If the one on the left here, you can see that's from Vancouver, and they have this very complex sorting station, and they have a video playing about how to use the station properly. And this works really well here, I think, because a lot of the people that were there were not native English speakers, so that kind of thing is really helpful. On the right, I don't know if you can see it, but this is another super complex sorting system, but they have these great, they're not signs, they're like displays above each item. Again, they're very specific. They show exactly what you could dispose of, and it's from the kind of things you would get in that very facility. So those kind of prompts are very good for reminding people to do the behavior. Of course, the downside about using prompts is you're not going to convince somebody who's in the pre-contemplation phase, who doesn't even want to recycle. All it does is get people who are already in the action phases or are already interested in doing the behavior to actually follow through. So we got the structural changes. Let's move on to the so-called psychological interventions. The first one is feedback. We don't often get feedback in environmental domains, so presenting people with feedback is often the first step to changing behavior. I managed to find this super high-tech, I don't even know if these things really exist, but on the internet I found a picture of them. These garbage bins that apparently show you what's inside and the weight as you're filling them up. So this gives you feedback on how much you're using. Probably not feasible here, but what might be feasible is the thing on the left. If you're able to measure the weights of the compost, garbage, recycling, et cetera, then if you post that feedback regularly, you might be able to see some behavior change. It's not perfect because we'd prefer on the individual level, but at least on the group level, you get some sort of feedback and you can feel like your behavior is having some sort of effect. Now, the more frequent, the better it is. In energy efficiency, the real-time feedback is better than weekly or on your bill or monthly or whatnot. Okay, reward and punishment. This is probably the one everybody's most familiar with for changing behavior. Both of them work. This is where you institute some rules with consequences. And I should mention the consequences don't have to be, like a fine. They don't have to be an incentive like a monetary incentive or even some sort of gift. It could be a social consequence, whereby people are publicly shamed or publicly praised, and this kind of thing can be very powerful as well. Now, I don't know if anybody here does clinical psychology or developmental, but obviously you know about the differences between reward and punishment and what has sort of effects, what kind of unintended effects this might have. But if you do a punishment, you might have the negative unintended consequence of the punishment being associated with the punisher and some sort of negative feelings towards the organization or the person as opposed to about the act itself. So rewarding a behavior is much more easy to implement and it's much more pleasant. Whether it works better or worse is a question that's up for discussion. I also want to mention that I sort of touched on this earlier, if the reward or punishment is the sole reason for changing, then people may stop the behavior when the reward or punishment is removed. Again, this is the classical conditioning paradigm. If people are just doing it, this is like crazy, but if people could get fired for recycling, for not recycling, they'd recycle. As soon as that threat is removed, they'd probably stop recycling. In fact, you might see a reactance and they go back to more than that. Similarly, if they're doing it for like $50 for every item you recycle, people are going to do it. But as soon as that $50 is removed, you might see the behavior stopping or at least going back to baseline. You also have some possible reverse effects. So this is actually, I read about this in one early study. They tried to encourage recycling by paying people for paper that they brought back to the recycling depot. And you know what happened? People would go out and use extra paper so that they could win, get more money. So again, you're emphasizing the reward as opposed to the behavior itself. So you're not creating this intrinsic motivation, and you could have some reverse effects. Okay, so my last point about this is that you should think about what is currently being rewarded. So if, for example, it's a lot easier and faster and more pleasant to just throw everything in the garbage than it is to recycle, you're kind of creating you're sort of rewarding throwing things in the garbage and making it harder, punishing throwing things in the recycling, right? So think about the current implicit or explicit rewards and punishments that you have and see if you can change that. Getting people to pledge to recycle. So it turns out that when you have people make a written or verbal pledge or commitment to comply, they're more likely to follow through. Getting people to set goals, especially if they're setting their own goals, can be very helpful. And at this point, it's good to also solicit implementation intentions. Get people to explain exactly how they're going to reach that goal of recycling, of doing more. And what I like to do is try to encourage if-then statements so that people are automatically able to just implement a rule that they've memorized instead of having to think about it. And try to make the commitment public if possible. There's research on energy efficiency. When you go to people's houses and knock on their door and you say, hey, would you commit to using less electricity in the next 2 months? And if they say yes and you write their name down, they're likely to do it. But if you say yes and your name's going to be made public, they're even more likely to do it. So one possible idea, which I haven't seen tested yet, is distributing signs or buttons or stickers that you can put on your desk area or wear around that say, I recycle or I recycle my plastics or what have you, sort of making a public commitment, and that should help people follow through. One downside, of course, I've alluded to before, it's not going to work if people are not already interested in doing the behavior. So this is not a good intervention if people don't think recycling is a good idea, obviously. So think about your target audience. Okay, information education, this is the single most popular intervention. You can do workshops to encourage recycling and teach how to do it. You could do guided group discussion. Guided group discussion is great because it gets people involved. Essentially, you're getting people to come to their own conclusions about why recycling is important and why they should do it and how often they should do it and that kind of thing. At the University of Victoria, I worked with a waste reduction coordinator. She had this great presentation where she would create a discussion about composting and recycling, and then she would hand out recyclable material and say, okay, you come up here and you sort it out. And then they would sort it, and then she would say, okay, let's go through the bins. This doesn't go here, this goes here, this doesn't go here. How many people knew that this was a mistake? And by doing that, it really brought home the idea of what can be recycled. People think they know, but sometimes they don't. So getting active involvement is really helpful. Using persuasive messages, so just thinking about how your message is crafted, using social psychology principles to change attitudes, to strengthen your altruistic or ecological values, to strengthen the commitment that we've been talking about, to change the perception of social norms. So, did you know that everybody else is recycling? And people, once they know that, are more likely to do it as well. And of course, heightening awareness of the problem. Now, I should mention, heightening awareness of the problem doesn't on its own usually trigger behavior. This is something you might do if people are in the pre-contemplation or contemplation phases, but I wouldn't recommend it if people are already trying to implement action because they already know what needs to be done. So again, this is the kind of intervention you might use for people in pre-contemplation, contemplation, or maybe planning stages. Okay, so last category here, social. Social interventions. The first one is about public observability. When you bring awareness to people doing good behavior, they're more likely to do that. So you get people to sign up for an energy efficiency program where the energy company can throttle your air conditioning use on a really hot day. If people are made aware, their name on the sign-up sheet is clear to everybody else, they're more likely to sign up than if their name is anonymous, which is very interesting. It means that if we can bring awareness to this behavior, recycling is kind of a private sphere behavior, so it needs to be kind of brought out. And if you can do that, you might be able to encourage recycling. This is off the top of my head. I don't know how it would work here, but this is probably, I don't know. I might not do this, but it seems like an interesting idea. A sign above the recycling bin with everybody's name. If you recycle something, put a little check mark, and then you kind of see the thing growing. And this kind of thing might help elucidate the behavior, make it more clear. If you can think of more inventive and creative ways, I would love to hear them, because I think that this is something that could help. And then, of course, there's awards for recycling or some sort of public recognition for being a good ecological citizen. Okay, the next part is social modeling. So this is actually what I did my master's thesis on. Seeing other people compost apparently makes you significantly more likely to compost as well. It's significant but small. So, but it does work. So if this is not about policy change, it's about being the change you want to see. Real people or even video demonstrations of a behavior can encourage that behavior. One thing that could work is recruiting eco-team volunteers. So people whose job it is, they kind of take it on themselves to go out and lead by example. This kind of thing can really change a social network and change a culture, which goes to my next point, which is tapping the value of social networks, using a block leader or a champion of change. These are all different names for the similar idea. If you recruit an eco-team, then they can encourage people in their social networks or their departments or their units or their floors to take action on not on climate change, in this case on recycling. Now, one important aspect of this strategy is to hold regular meetings so people feel like they're supported, so they feel like they're part of a group and that what they're doing is making a difference, they're not by themselves. As an optional addition, you can also train volunteers. This is something I did at the University of Victoria in residences. Residences were extremely bad at recycling rates, much worse than the rest of the university. So we went in there, we recruited volunteers, we trained them on how to talk to other people about recycling, and we assigned homework assignments, go out and talk to X number of people about it. And they were super jazzed about it and really went out and went above and beyond, started organizing their own events and that kind of thing. So the eco teams could be really helpful. Now, who do you recruit for an eco team? Either popular opinion leaders, so celebrities at work, or passionate recyclers. Now, of course, if you recruit somebody who's really excited about environmental issues, you have to talk to them about how to talk to other people, because that's an important part of disseminating this. If you recruit some sort of very popular celebrity type person at work, then you have to explain to them the value of recycling so that they can talk about that. Both are very helpful. Recruiting somebody, an authority figure, would be very helpful as well. So, the boss, if they're talking to other people about recycling, then that's going to help encourage that behavior. All right, not too many left. Competition, game, or contest. This is becoming much more popular these days than it used to be. The key part about implementing a game or a competition for recycling is it has to be fun. It has to be a fun game with real-world consequences, not just like a point system like Air Miles. You're doing it because you really want to, and you have some sort of intrinsic motivation for doing so. So one problem that you could come across with using contests to try to encourage people to change behavior is that if you're losing the contest, you're not going to be very motivated to change your behavior. Those guys at the top, they're really excited about it because they're doing great. What we did at ACEEE, we have this energy scorecard. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but we have an energy scorecard for like international, 25 most energy consuming countries, and we have one for states, and we have one for cities. So for the international one, it's like perpetually, I don't know if you guys can guess which countries are the most efficient. Any ideas? Say? Most efficient country? Switzerland. No, it's in Germany. Oh, it's in Europe. I gave it away. It's Germany. And tied is Japan. So those countries are perpetually at the top. So how do you encourage those non-top countries that feel like they're never going to make it? We also offer a most improved award. So you're kind of trying to get everybody involved at these competitions. And what about persistence? Well, with a competition, it necessarily has to end. So what happens after the competition's done? Do people continue to recycle? Do they continue to change their behavior, or do they revert back? Again, the competition is effective if it breaks the habits, gives them the opportunity to repeat it, change the triggers, et cetera. So implementing new habits and also kind of triggers an intrinsic motivation for complying. If they're just doing it to win the game, or to win the contest, then chances are when the contest is done, the behavior will be too. So that's the 3 types of programs. I just wanted to quickly touch on a few other considerations. Are you looking for long-term or short-term outcomes? So you forgot to reinforce my behavior. There's some, depending on what you want to accomplish, you might have a different strategy. It's like if you're going on a diet, if you're trying to get thin for just like a special event, you might go on some crazy diet that you would never normally do and then immediately stop afterwards. Whereas if you're trying to change your lifestyle, you might use a different approach. Well, with behavior change programs for energy efficiency or recycling, you got the same sort of thing. If you want to use something short-term, I recommend a strong punishment or a strong reward. This will get people to change very quickly and very effectively. However, might not change for a long time. If you're looking for a longer-term result that may not be as effective or obvious from the beginning, you might want to try a sort of social network approach. In a meta-analysis of social influence strategies that were most effective, I found that block leader approach was the most effective strategy out of the ones that were looked at. So what I would recommend is consider a solution that addresses both short and long term. Have some consequences and incentives built in, but also think about including maybe eco-team volunteers or people modeling the behavior and that kind of thing. All right, so I was asked to talk about what doesn't work. As I've kind of alluded to throughout this presentation, the things that don't work is when you don't customize your intervention properly. And I should mention, there's no one intervention that works for everybody all the time. In fact, the best you should hope to do is some people some of the time. Sometimes interventions don't work at all. So that being said, I usually don't recommend only using general information about why recycling is important, because you're unlikely to change a specific behavior. This kind of information is helpful if people are in the pre-contemplation phase, maybe, but usually it doesn't actually do very much. So know your audience is really the most important thing. And on that note, oh wait, no, before that, I'm going to talk to you about barriers to change. This is another topic I was asked to talk about. Why do people not change when they know it's the right thing to do, or when they want to change? For this, I'm going to whip through 30 barriers that have been summarized into about 10 sub-barriers. These are prepared by my former PhD supervisor, Robert Gifford. So obviously there's structural barriers. You know, nobody's going to recycle if they don't have a bin, if the bin's not within their reach or whatnot. But there's also psychological barriers. Why don't people do it even when they have the opportunity? I'll tell you. These are the dragons of inaction. The first one is limited cognition. This mostly applies to climate change, but does apply a little bit here. Our ancient brains they're wired to respond to stress and to clear and present danger. We don't think of like recycling or these other environmental issues as something that requires like an immediate fight or flight or freeze response. So we're just not biologically designed for it. Or I should also mention we might not be aware of it. It might be outside of our awareness. Ideologies. We don't really need to do anything because eventually we're just going to invent a contraption that deals with all these problems, so why bother? Or, you know, my religion dictates that some higher power is going to determine, you know, what happens to the earth anyway, so why do I have to bother with it? Other people. Nobody else around me is recycling, so I'm not going to do it. Or everybody does it, so I'm going to as well. Sunk costs. You know, I already invested in all this plastic cutlery and disposable plates. I'm not going to use my reusable mug because that takes more work. I've already invested. Discredence. I just don't really think that recycling is a problem. I don't trust scientists, which is more of a climate change thing. Perceived risks. If I change and nobody else does, then I'm going to be losing out. Or it's less sanitary to use reusable mugs than it is to disposable mugs. So there's some sort of risk involved, and that's why people don't do it. Limited behavior. I already recycle at home. Why should I bother recycling here? I turn off the lights. I unplug all my devices. I should be able to throw my paper cup in the garbage rather than using something recyclable or whatnot. Okay, so there you go. Barriers to change. If you actually want to implement an intervention, I like the do right method, not just because that is a clever acronym, but because it's a good strategy. This is proposed by Geller. First, define the problem. So as I mentioned, be as specific as you can. Talk about recycling and exactly what you want to recycle, and specify the behavior, time, type of behavior, etc. Observe the behavior. So this involves talking to people about why they don't recycle, learning about what stage of change they're in, and really thinking about where people are at and what they're doing currently. Record occurrences. So I like doing this scientifically. So if possible, get a baseline measure of how much people are recycling already so that you can really know if your intervention is actually successful or not. So with all that, you then develop your intervention and you actually intervene. And you implement it for a specific amount of time within a specific population, and you test the impact. Again, I like to include a control group whenever possible, but you really have to get creative, and sometimes that's not possible. So a quasi-experimental design, I feel like I'm talking to a lot of people that already know this stuff, so I'm not going to dig too much into it, but you'll want some sort of comparison group in order to be able to determine if it's really the intervention that's making a difference. And then finally, you want to evaluate the costs. You know, is it worth it to implement this intervention on a long term? How much will it cost, and is it feasible? So that's everything. That's how you change behavior in recycling. Thank you very much for having me.